Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jane Sanchez. I'm the Deputy Librarian for Library Collections and Services for the Library of Congress, and I'm also pleased to serve as the 25th Law Librarian of Congress. I'm very pleased today to welcome Patricia Lee Rifo, a partner at Snell and Wilmer in Phoenix, Arizona. She is currently the president of the American Bar Association, the largest voluntary association of attorneys and legal professionals in the world. Trish, thank you for joining us today for this virtual interview and helping us celebrate Law Day. So now,
I'm delighted to be with you, Jane.
Thank you so much. Let's get started. So, Law Day is a national day to celebrate the rule of law and its contributions to the freedoms Americans enjoy. A day aimed to promote and remind people to appreciate their liberties and cultivate respect for the law, which is vital to our American democratic way of life. The theme for this year's Law Day is advancing the rule of law now. What does the rule of law mean to you, Trish?
The rule of law is sort of a complicated concept, even though it's just a couple of words, but it's hard sometimes to express it in a fulsome way. So component parts of the rule of law include things like a system that holds not just individuals, but the government too, accountable to the people. A system in which courts and disputes are open and transparent, where people can see what it is that is going on as the law is applied, and that the law be applied fairly to everyone, that it not single out one group of people and treat them somehow differently from others. So there are a lot of pieces, really, of the rule of law that can sometimes make it challenging to explain in a soundbite.
Americans will agree that rule of law is important, but many may not be clear on what rule of law is and its significance. How would you explain it? And I know you kind of touched on this in your earlier response.
Well, one of the things that is important to understand is that the rule of law is not the same as following a law. For example, if someone passed a law that said all redheads will lose every case they bring to a courtroom, that would be a law, but following it would be contrary to the rule of law, which would say that such a crazy law would be, wrong and inappropriate and discriminatory against redheads. So it's different from just saying that one has to follow the law. It's deeper than that. It's about what are the basic concepts and principles that we as a democracy and we as a nation that follows the rule of law believe in. And that includes, as we've said, making sure that both individuals and the government are accountable, and making sure that our legal processes are transparent and open, and that the law is applied fairly.
All right, very good. Trish, can you tell us about the American Bar Association's Rule of Law Initiative? How does this program promote and advance rule of law here and abroad? And can you identify several impacts?
Well, thank you for that question, because I love talking about our Rule of Law Initiative. We call it ROLI for short, R-O-L-I. ROLI is a program that the American Bar Association has been engaged in for some decades to help bring the rule of law around the world to countries who ask for our help in helping to establish the rule of law. For example, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there were a number of newly emerging democracies in Europe who reached out to the American Bar Association because They were setting up systems around the rule of law that they'd never had before. And they needed expert help and advice and guidance about how to set up their systems and how to make sure that they worked properly once they were set up. So that was how the Rule of Law Initiative got started. And since then, we've worked in dozens of countries on every continent, I think, making sure that we are there to help governments that are trying to figure out how to make their systems of justice and their democracies more fair, more consistent with the rule of law. So we work on things like access to justice. We work on things like making sure that political dissidents are not repressed, that they too can be heard and be free. We work on empowering women and girls in democracy, in countries where they may not be as free as they are in the United States. We work on issues around domestic violence and persecution of persons as a consequence of gender identity or gender expression, and lots of other things to try and bring the rule of law and the principles that we've been talking about to countries that are still learning about how to incorporate those things into their culture and into their justice system.
Very good. Thank you. Kind of switching gears a little bit, how has the pandemic and related public health restrictions impacted access to justice, and how has the legal profession responded to this challenge?
Wow, big question and big answers, right? I mean, the pandemic has just been obviously devastating in so many ways in our country. And one of the ways that it's been so awful is how it has affected financially and otherwise persons of limited means, folks who do not have the money to address the civil legal issues that they are facing now as a consequence of the pandemic. One huge example is around evictions. Obviously, when folks started to lose jobs and lose income, they also began to lose the ability to be able to pay the rent for the place that they live. And that has enormous consequences for an individual and certainly for a family if people lose housing. And so the American Bar Association and lots of other organizations have been trying to work to figure out how to address that eviction potential sort of tsunami that we were all facing. We have lobbied Congress to make sure that the moratorium on evictions that protects people from being thrown out in the street right now is extended, and it has been several times. We are working with Congress to figure out aid, financial aid that addresses not just the needs of the renters, but the needs of the landlords, because a significant percentage of our affordable housing stock in this country is actually owned, if you will, by mom and pop landlords. Who, if they're not getting the rent income that they need, may be facing challenges themselves in terms of paying the mortgage, for example, on the rental property. So we've worked very, very hard on the eviction piece of it. Another significant challenge and a sad challenge has been around domestic violence, because when the lockdown started, we had situations all over the country and frankly all over the world in which victims of domestic violence were locked up with their abusers and needed help to get out of those situations. So the American Bar Association has been involved in making sure that we're providing assistance, and that our state and local bar partners are providing assistance to those victims of domestic violence. But there are all kinds of other issues around debt collection, around loan forgiveness. You can imagine all of the challenges that people are facing in an economic environment in which so many have lost their jobs. And we're there trying to help in as many ways as we can. Another example of what we've been doing is in a program that's called ABA Free Legal Answers, which is a system an online system that allows someone who is financially qualified to use the program to post a question, and a volunteer lawyer licensed in the state where the individual resides or has the legal problem can volunteer to just give them an answer to the civil legal question that they've posed. So lots and lots of different ways that we've been working to try and ameliorate the really difficult challenges that we're facing and that our fellow citizens are facing in the midst of this pandemic.
Okay, thank you. How can the legal profession leverage the rule of law to promote racial equity and justice for all in our society?
Oh, that is such a huge issue. The very definition of the rule of law is that every person will be treated equally. And so there simply is no room at all in a rule of law system for someone to be treated differently because of their ethnicity or their race or their religion or any other characteristic of them as a human being. So making sure that all people are treated equally has long been a core principle of the American Bar Association, to eliminate bias and to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion in our justice system and in the legal profession. We work hard to make sure that we have a seat at all the tables in which these issues are being talked about at the national level. We work hard to make sure that we as an association are doing everything we can to promote anti-racism and racial equity in our court systems, in our policing practices, and in the legal profession itself. One very exciting thing that we've just launched is called the American Bar Association Legal Education Police Practice Consortium. And it's a consortium of 52 law schools in the United States who have come together at the American Bar Association to work on issues around how to enhance and modernize police practices to, among other things, address the racial inequities that still exist in our justice system.
Okay, all right, thank you. For the last several years, the Law Library has written a number of reports on artificial intelligence, which is, of course, AI, and technology. And this has been a spotlight worldwide, and the reports have been well received from many, many groups outside the library. How has AI and technology impacted the rule of law?
Well, I would start, I guess, by saying that when I graduated from law school, we looked stuff up only in books, and now in actual libraries, right? And now we do it all from our computers. And most lawyers would tell you that they can use research tools just from their computer to figure out the answers to questions that their clients pose. That's been a huge change in the years that I've been practicing law. And artificial intelligence, of course, is going to continue to overlay a whole nother set of issues on top of all of that. Lawyers are deep in a moment of change. This pandemic has changed completely how lawyers practice and the way in which lawyers practice, because most of us still aren't back to our offices yet, and are using everything in remote technology to both represent our clients and to argue clients' cases in courts. So artificial intelligence is particularly being used in aspects of the law in which common things like a contract or whatever can be repeated with slight variations over significant numbers of transactions, finding that it can be much less expensive to a client to use that kind of technology than to have to sort of reinvent the wheel every time for the same contract or the same transaction. So the technology and AI changes in the law are really only just beginning, and we will watch them unfold with greater speed, literally day to day, as the continued growth in all of this technology unfolds. We've put a ridiculous amount of change into the last year of the legal profession, and I don't think that's going to slow down anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Trish, do you have any recommendations how law librarians and academics can contribute to rule of law?
So one of the things that I think about that is that law librarians and the academy generally are folks who are evidence-based, are fact-based in their training. And more and more and more, we need to think of the rule of law through those sorts of measurements. We need to be able to identify the measurable outcomes around what makes the rule of law work. And I think law librarians and legal scholars and members of the academy, as I've said more generally, can really help us to not only think through how we do that, but help us to actually measure the objective metrics around whether or not we're making things happen in a way that is consistent with the rule of law. I mean, one of the things that's going on in the legal profession a lot in a number of states right now is around whether we should change the regulation of lawyers in a way that makes more people in a position to be able to get some kind of legal services, whether it's from a lawyer or someone who's not a lawyer and the like, to make the rule of law more accessible to everybody. And measuring the outcomes of those changes in the regulation of lawyers is a very important topic and something that the ABA is very involved with, and the Academy as well.
Okay. Trish, what are your top priorities as ABA president?
Well, Jane, I'll tell you what, I had a list before the pandemic started, and then I had to kind of start over again. Not completely, but a fair amount. I became ABA president in August. The pandemic hit us, the shutdowns began in March. So I had some warning, but we obviously reworked some of our priorities to address the pandemic situation. And one set of stuff that we've already talked about is addressing the legal needs in our country that arise out of the pandemic. But we've also devoted an enormous amount of energy and resources to helping lawyers figure out how to do what lawyers do, even in the midst of a pandemic. Things like doing hearings and trials on virtual platforms. Doing a trial through your computer screen is a whole different thing than doing a trial in person with 12 jurors across the room from you. Those are things that we've been working on a lot, is making sure that we're helping the profession and the court systems, frankly, to figure out ways to be effective, even though we can't be physically together. The Police Practicing Consortium that I mentioned earlier with 52 law schools has been a significant priority for us. And we're also always working on things that help lawyers to be better lawyers. We have a host of programming that we offer, some for free, some our members pay for, but it is around making each of us better lawyers from an ethics standpoint, better lawyers in our specific specialties. I mean, I, for example, happen to be a commercial litigator, which means I represent business interests most typically in courtroom-related proceedings. And there are all kinds of programs that I can go to that help me to do better at what I do in my job. Same is true if you're a trademark lawyer or a lawyer who writes contracts for a living. So making sure that the quality of our programming continues to be as high as it is a priority for us. And of course, we do a lot of work in Washington on Capitol Hill and with the administration around the issues that lawyers care about. Things like adequate funding for our federal court system, things like adequate funding for the Legal Services Corporation, which is the organization that funds all the civil legal aid clinics in the United States. Security for our federal judges, extremely important issue in light of some of the terrible things that have happened of late and attacks on our judges and on their families. All of these are things that the American Bar Association works on and that are priorities for us.
Okay. Trish, to wrap up, what advice can you give new lawyers who are passionate about promoting rule of law and expanding access to justice? Can you suggest ways they can advance rule of law?
Well, the first thing you should do is join the American Bar Association, because we are one of the, if not the prime defender of the rule of law, not just in this country, but around the world. But, you know, the reason that folks want to become lawyers in the first instance is almost always at its core around wanting to help people who need help. That is, I believe, the reason why most lawyers go to law school in the first place. And taking pro bono cases where you represent someone in need for free is among the most rewarding work any lawyer does. And there are opportunities, big and small, to take on those cases even when you're in law school, because lots of states permit students who are still in law school to undertake limited representation if they're properly supervised to help real people with real legal problems who need real help. And as I've said, that in my career, those cases have absolutely been the most rewarding opportunities, because you can see the actual difference it makes in someone's life.
All right. Well, thank you, Trish, for being with us today. It's been a true pleasure talking with you and continuing our tradition of celebrating Law Day with the American Bar Association. Thank you to our audience for joining the Law Library and the American Bar Association's 2021 Law Day celebration. I would like to conclude this event by mentioning that on April 29th, once again, the Law Library of Congress and the American Bar Association will be co-hosting a panel discussion on this year's Law Day theme, Advancing the Rule of Law Now. You will find registration instructions at our site, law.gov. We hope you can join us. Have a great rest of your day, everyone, and we look forward to joining us again. Thank you. Bye-bye.